In part to address the criticism that greeted his drinking, Trungpa Rinpoche wrote a monograph on the topic in 1972 that he entitled Amrita as Medicine or Poison. Amrita in Sanskrit means non-death and usually refers to a complex concoction of alcohol mixed with herbs. In the space of 1,500 words or so, Rinpoche first presents the range of attitudes to drinking in different cultures and eras. He then discusses the practice of what he calls conscious drinking in different spiritual traditions. Quote, whether alcohol is to be a poison or a medicine depends on awareness during drinking. For the conscious drinker, for the yogi, the virtue of alcohol is that it brings him down to reality so that he does not perish into non-discriminating meditation. For him, alcohol acts as a longevity potion. When the yogi drinks, it is his way of accepting the unmanifest reality of non-duality as the dualistic world of ordinary appearance. The world demands his attention, his relationship and compassion. He is glad and amused to have this invitation to communicate. End quote. This account may seem like an elaborate rationalization, but it makes lucid sense to me and succinctly describes how my teacher functioned in the world. Trungpa Rinpoche's motor functions might have been so compromised from alcohol that he needed physical help in and out of his teaching chair. Though that might be the case, I never once had the sense during a talk that his mind or his ability to communicate was impaired. He might have been unusually slow and deliberate in choosing and enunciating words, but then he was always slow and deliberate. When Rinpoche was drunk, he was somehow completely himself. There is a further clue to Rinpoche's unconventional behavior in his discussion at the end of the 1973 seminary when he first introduced the tantric teachings in a careful graded regimen to a group of senior students. Trungpa Rinpoche was a lama of the Kagyu school, whose main practice is the Mahamudra Tantra, which translates as great symbol. Very crudely, this tantra promotes practices that enable the adept to perceive dualistic phenomena as so vivid and luminous they become transparent. But Rinpoche's main teacher was Sachin Kongtrul Rinpoche, who was a lama of the Nyingma lineage, the oldest of Tibetan schools, whose ultimate practice is Ati, or Dzogchen in Tibetan, which means great perfection. Ati masters may succeed in transcending dualistic phenomena altogether. The final talk of his 1973 seminary, Trungpa Rinpoche said, any high Maha-Ati teacher must be Sybaritic. The more Sybaritic they are, the more love they have for their students. That's the whole thing. They are sort of bringing themselves down instead of taking themselves off into the whatever. This whatever, in my view, implies disengagement from the mundane reality in both figurative and literal senses. Toward the end of his life, Trungpa Rinpoche was increasingly detached from the physical realm in which we all lived. He was also prone to violent mishaps, including his car wreck and at least 2 serious falls, none of which I believe were accidents in any conventional sense. Rinpoche had no reason to exist apart from his commitment to teach Dharma to his students, and the realm of the senses was his anchor to their world. So why did Trungpa Rinpoche drink so much, even as he knew the practice was killing him? Why did he consort with so many women, even long after he lost his sexual capacity? Why did he practice such overt controversial behaviors, knowing that many people might conclude that he was a fraud? In my view, it was for the same reason that he favored the finest of cashmere for his overcoats, the ear-splitting blast of his field cannon, the subtlest of incense for his sitting room, and the most succulent meat for his plate. He was a Sybarite because the realm of the senses seduced him to teach, to fulfill his karma by sticking around in our messy, neurotic world. Frequently, we were too fearful and ignorant to appreciate this, which is why visiting Tibetans would get so angry with us if we complained about Rinpoche's drinking. They understood he was sacrificing himself on our behalf, that he was a completely remarkable being of unparalleled fearlessness and compassion. They must have wondered whether we understood who he was or deserved the good fortune of having met him at all. This explanation may be construed as further denial by an enabler. Many people who respect Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings and even serve within his organizations prefer the formulation that his drinking and sexuality represented his dark side, which all human beings, enlightened or not, manifest. This is a wrong view. The Trungpa Rinpoche I knew was endlessly gentle, patient, and kind, but he did indeed have a dark and unpredictable side that was scary to experience. I saw him angry only once, when he appropriately threw the beat poet Gregory Corso out of a talk for persistently heckling him. Corso was a fine poet, but also a drunken barbarian, and kept yelling things like, "Smart fucker," and "You tell him, chuggy." Rinpoche eventually yelled at his guards to remove him, and a dark, poisonous cloud enveloped the room. During his final retreat at Mill Village in Nova Scotia, Rinpoche's behavior became increasingly erratic and tough to be around. Only the closest of students were able to handle it, and it was often frightening and disorienting for them. This indeed was Trungpa Rinpoche's dark side. His drinking and sexuality were part of his dance of the senses, his way of communicating with the world. Then just a little bit. After Diana Mokpo's brave memoir appeared in 2006, she was interviewed for the cover story of the Shambhala Sun, the national periodical on Buddhism and culture that was begun by members of our Sangha. Predictably, Diana was asked direct questions about Rinpoche's drinking and sexuality, which inevitably remained central questions about his life. Diana answered these questions candidly and persuasively, as she had already done in the book. On the subject of his alcohol use, she responded, "I think that Rinpoche probably drank because it facilitated his ability to teach in the West. I think he drank because he felt that he was able to harness more energy to teach." Of his sexuality, she said, Rinpoche had intimate relationships in many different ways with many of his students, and the fact that he slept with different women was an expression of the intimacy that he had with people. Another thing that was important was that Rinpoche never attempted to hide anything about his behavior. I didn't really have any difficulty with it because I think that people were never exploited. In the following issue of The Sun, there were published a couple of letters from outrage readers, which I suspect were representative of a much broader response. The first writer, a woman with a PhD from Santa Barbara, California, with a long and intimate knowledge of our community, made the following points. Unfortunately, the traditions and justifications of excessive drinking kept a lot of alcoholics in the community from getting the help they desperately needed to live a sober life. And further, Rinpoche sleeping with his students simply prolonged the adolescence of the community. I can understand how vital boundaries could have been crossed during that period, yet this old sad story of abuse of power was exploitative and harmful to many students. Many of Rinpoche's students' marriages were torn apart in the experiment of openness. The second letter writer, comparing Rinpoche's activities to recent scandals among Christian clergy, simply called his behavior abhorrent. The accusations made by the first writer strike me as largely true. A significant percentage of our community has struggled with alcoholism, and although a Buddhist-inspired recovery group was formed in the 1980s, the prevailing attitude toward drinking has typically been cavalier and permissive. And indeed, our community has had a most prolonged adolescence regarding sexuality, livelihood, and many other adult obligations. In this context, I think it is fair to say that the example set by Rinpoche was harmful, and I've already conceded that it is beside the point to argue that Rinpoche did not advocate that we should emulate those behaviors. But it must also be conceded that we are an immature and permissive generation. We were determined to break out of our parents' black and white movie of duty and conformity and connect with what really mattered and have a party while we were about it. The stability and prosperity that our parents bequeathed us, together with our sheer demographic clout, gave us our sense of entitlement. This is the culture that Trungpa Rinpoche encountered when he arrived in North America in 1970, and he responded with the courage, compassion, and skill that I hope I have presented. Had he encountered a different culture, he would have reacted differently. He was always destined to be an unconventional teacher, but his particular style was determined by the historical context in which he found himself. Different individuals who advised me on the composition of this memoir have suggested that I avoid discussion of this topic altogether because I lack what the Tantric tradition calls the higher perceptions, and am therefore not qualified to speculate about the unfathomable behavior of an enlightened being. I cannot comply with this advice. If Buddhism is to take root in the Western culture, it must accommodate its norms of individual rights and personal accountability. Those of us who continue to teach within the Shambhala community are regularly confronted by sincere questions from people interested in our Sangha, but who are confused by Rinpoche's behavior regarding sex and alcohol. We cannot simply evade the issue. Our community has perhaps been slow to take responsibility around these topics, but it has done so. Alcoholism is recognized as an illness, and recovery groups meet in most centers. And our organization recognizes that sexual relations between teacher and student are inappropriate and has banned them. All teachers at important programs in the Shambhala community are now required to read and sign a document called Intimate Relations with Participants that disallows such conduct and establishes penalties for violation. These are healthy developments. Nevertheless, before our community matured to this extent, we almost perished in the early 90s over the specific issue of sexual misconduct. So that was a long-winded response to your question, but I do try and present how I understood Rinpoche's unconventional behavior, sexuality and drinking during his life. I also present what I feel were the repercussions of those behaviors for us as a community. I feel they were harmful. And I think as a community, we're still maturing around these issues. The reason I actually stick my neck out and talk about these things is that my teacher Trungpa Rinpoche actually believed that Tantric Buddhism can be taught in the West. He didn't believe it should stay secret. He didn't believe that Westerners couldn't understand it. So he believes it can flourish, it can actually take root in the West. And wherever Buddhism has traveled, it's adopted to the norms of those societies that it encounters. So Buddhism has to adopt to the norms of our modern Western society with all its protections and norms around individual rights. That's what I believe.
So I think actually this would be a great time.
Yes, it would actually. Thank you, Karen.
And so I would love to invite everyone to come behind here to the parlor we have.